Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dr. Fermi Okunlami. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm a middle-aged Black man with short black hair, dark rimmed glasses, a wooden bow tie, and a colorful collared shirt with a maroon vest. And I'm the Director of Student Accessibility and Accommodation Services here at the University of Michigan, which means I have the distinct pleasure of being the director of our adaptive sports and fitness program. And so I am thrilled to partner with Exercise and Sports Science Initiative here at Michigan to host Erica Gavel, Jason Hartnett, Dr. Johan Latorre, and Michael Frogley to discuss the changing classification systems in wheelchair basketball and wheelchair tennis. First, a few housekeeping items. We have CART and ASL interpretation to improve the accessibility of this panel. And it is also being recorded and will be shared afterwards on our websites and on YouTube. Now to introduce our esteemed panelists. First, we have Ms. Erica Gavel. She is a Paralympian and a PhD candidate at Ontario Tech University in the Faculty of Science studying environmental physiology and Paralympic performance. Erica is a member of the Canadian Paralympic Committee Athlete Commission and the International Paralympic Committee Sports Science and Research Working Group. Thank you for joining us, Erica. Next up, we have Mr. Jason Hartnett. Jason has been the head coach for Team USA Wheelchair Tennis since 2016. He has attended 5 Paralympic Games and 4 Para-Pan Am Games, and he was the captain of 9 BNP World Team Cup Championship teams from 1998 to 2017. Welcome, Jason. Next up, we have Dr. Johan Latorre, who has been part of the Adaptive Sports and Fitness program at the University of Michigan since its inception. He is the volunteer coach for the wheelchair tennis team and is currently a primary care sports medicine fellow at the University of Michigan. Johan also completed his residency in physical medicine and rehabilitation here with us. So thank you, Dr. Latorre.
Thank you.
And last but certainly not least, we add another Canadian national to this team. We've got Mr. Mike Frogley, who served as the head coach of Team Canada's men's wheelchair basketball team from 1996 to 2004, where he guided them to back-to-back Paralympic gold medals in 2000 and 2004, as well as a Paralympic silver in 2008. Frogley has also spent 21 years coaching wheelchair basketball in the U.S. collegiate system at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, and then at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, where he led his teams to a combined 12 national championships. Now, we are very excited to host this panel today for a conversation that hopefully will be very stimulating. Now, this discussion is going to focus on the classification systems in wheelchair basketball and wheelchair tennis. The classification systems in parasport group athletes with an eligible disability into classes and are intended to create equitable competition between athletes. Classification aims to minimize the impact of impairment on athletes' performance so that sporting excellence determines which athlete or team is ultimately victorious. Now, wheelchair tennis is comprised of 2 sport classes. The open class is for athletes with permanent impairment of one or both legs, but with full arm function. And then the quad class, which I classify into, is for athletes with additional restrictions in the playing arm, which limits the ability to then handle the racket and maneuver the wheelchair. So we're going to start this first question off for Dr. Latorre. So Johan, can you please elaborate on the 2 sport classes of wheelchair tennis and why they're separated in this way? And does this current system, in your opinion, create equitable competition?
Thanks again for the introduction, Dr. O. So as Dr. O mentioned just now, there's 2 sports classes. There's the open and the quad. Simply put, open is pretty much you have an impairment that affects one or both of your lower limbs, while the quad increases that by also including one of your upper limbs. So at least three extremities are affected. And it has to be a significant impairment that prohibits you from playing able-bodied tennis, essentially. So no classification system is exactly perfect. So there's always going to be some trade-offs, but the good aspect from the old system is that a lot of more people were essentially, it was more inclusive. So a lot more people were involved. But however, one kind of con is that because it's so broad in terms of how you're classified, there's certain kind of individuals who have a little bit more competitive advantage. For example, if you're in the open and you have a spinal cord injury, if you're a high thoracic spine versus a lumbar spine, that pretty much affects whether you have trunk involvement or not. And if you have your trunk, that's going to increase your ability to hit stronger strokes, hit a stronger serve. So that does give you a significant advantage in that aspect. But the trade-off being, as I mentioned earlier, you're going to allow more people to be inclusive. The sport's going to be a little bit bigger with having more individuals involved.
So that gives us somewhat of the clinical side of how we actually determine classification, but we've got resident expert, Mr. Hartnett here. Can you give us your perspective as well on the classification, given your extensive experience with not just wheelchair tennis, but tennis in general? So Jason.
Thank you, Dr. O. I think it's always been in tennis kind of a controversial subject. Anytime there's classification involved, the fear that the playing field may not be as equitable as it should be. And the quad division, the men and women's open division, as we call it, has been pretty straightforward. I think there has always been debate over whether amputees should be competing against spinal cord injuries. I think that's always been a question and has been challenged, a challenge put before the International Tennis Federation, who essentially manages tennis globally. But the quad division, when it came into existence back in the late 90s, I think a lot of players felt the system was going to be, again, fairly objective. And I think clinically speaking, pretty fair. But as we've gone on, I think the mentality was, if we can find a classification system that everyone can agree upon, that more people will end up playing, and it'll be a fair playing field. And I think in some respects it did that early, but as the quad division specifically became more professionalized, you started bringing prize money, world ranking points, potential now the Grand Slams in tennis. All of us know Wimbledon and the US Open, the Australian Open, the French Open. Once those events started coming on board, you start to get players starting to push the boundaries of what classification is. And I think that's created a very challenging situation, not only for the International Tennis Federation, but for the IPC as well. But I think all in all, when you talk to players, I think they believe the system that's in place now, which is a 14-point system, 10 being the threshold for the division. I think a lot of players kind of like the way it is. And now it's just a matter of policing that line to ensure that there's fairness and it's done correctly. And the ITF has done a pretty good job involving classifiers and so forth. But I think all in all, I think that it is obviously necessary when you're talking about parasport or adaptive sports in general. Classification is always going to play a big part of that, and it's just a matter of how do we police it, and is it done fairly, and is it transparent? That's always been another challenge, I think, for governing bodies. The international side, both IPC and ITF, is making sure it's transparent and debatable potentially. When there's ever a question of an athlete, maybe not the question of forthrightness if an athlete's being true to the actual classification, but is it being done fairly, and can it be debated? I think that's a big part of it.
Now, speaking of debate, I also want to make sure that our attendees know that please feel free to put questions in the Q&A. And at the end of the presentation, we will do our best to try to get to as many questions as we can. So feel free to put them in the Q&A, and as we get to the end, I'll fire those up. So we also have the benefit of having some experienced individuals within the wheelchair basketball space as well. And classification in wheelchair basketball is slightly different than in wheelchair tennis. And so wheelchair basketball's classification is the grouping of players into classes based on the player's physical capacity to execute fundamental basketball movements. And unlike in wheelchair tennis, there are no different divisions of play based on classification. And so all players with eligible disabilities are then combined on team rosters and then compete against each other on the court. So Coach Frogley, can you elaborate a little bit on the classification system in wheelchair basketball? What do you think the implications are of having players with different classifications compete against each other, as opposed to the format that we already heard in wheelchair tennis? And then do you think that system creates equitable opportunities for competition?
So a bunch of different questions there. I guess what I'd start off by saying, and this is an important note as we look at classification in any of the para sports, that wheelchair basketball is based off, it's a functional system as opposed to what I will call a medical clinical system. And that's an important distinction because its roots actually are in self-determination. The idea that a classifier wouldn't necessarily need to be a doctor or a nurse, but could in fact be a former player. And the idea of how wheelchair basketball wanted to see itself conducted as a sport and really have the driving force behind the sport be the individuals who are the primary stakeholders in the sport. And that's been important in its history, and that'll be important as it moves forward. As you mentioned, each individual is given a point value based on, in essence, the number of muscles that they've got to use to execute the skills of wheelchair basketball. So it's a functional system. The more muscles you've got, the higher your point value. A good example, myself, I'm the lowest point value. My paralysis is from the chest down. So I have my chest muscles to use and all my arms to shoot, to push, to pass, dribble, whatever I need to do on the basketball court. But I have the fewest number of muscles in the point system. I'm given a point value of 1. An individual who's, say, a single below knee amputee, they've got obviously their chest muscles and arms like me, but they also have their abdominal muscles, their back extensors, hip flexors, their quads, their hamstrings, possibly some of their gastrocs. That would allow them a whole huge number of muscles beyond what I've got to also shoot, pass, dribble, push. They're at the highest point value of 4.1. In between, there are half-point increments. So 1, 1.52, 2.5, 3, 3.5, 4, 4.5. And what they do is once you've been assigned a point value, we have what's called the team balance rule, which means you're not allowed to put any more than 14 cumulative points on the court amongst the 5 players. You can put less, but typically it's teams are trying to get up to their functional maximum. That means you see combinations of players that are, say, a class 1 like myself, alongside players that are a 4.5 like a Patrick Anderson from Canada. What I really like about this is the way that the system brings people of different abilities together to compete on the court, and each of them having value. That is the challenge in the sport, is to ensure that you give meaningful value, meaningful roles to all the individuals in the sport. And it's a challenge for a coach, because then you've got to coach individuals that are on a wide spectrum of functional ability, but they've all got to do the same skills. One of the things I really like about that idea is that's sort of the story of people with different abilities. It's having to achieve the same goals, but finding a different path to that achievement, and knowing that a different path doesn't lessen the achievement of the goal. It's just a different path. So yeah, I really like the wheelchair basketball system. Does it have its flaws? Absolutely. The way it gets implemented, because it doesn't use what I'll say an objective evidence system, and there's obviously debate around that. What you've got is you've got 3 individuals who've been trained as classifiers to all look at an individual, assess them, and come to a point of agreement. That, that has its varying levels of effectiveness, as coaches and players around the world would point to, but it's a really neat system. I think that 1 is rooted in self-determination, and 2 is really focuses on ability, and then 3 gets as many different types of abilities playing together on the court at the same time.
Thanks, Mike. Now, Erica, I've seen you smiling and nodding in agreement at times with some of the things that Coach Frogley has been saying. So please lend your perspective to this space, because I know that you've got your own sort of experience with it as well. So what are your thoughts on the same question?
Well, I'm actually laughing because Frog's been my coach for about 7 years, and that's the most polite way I've heard him speak of classification. But I think, I mean, like, as you kind of mentioned, wheelchair basketball is going through a big change, and I happen to be a part of that group of individuals that is going through that change. So I think my perspective on everything has definitely evolved over time. But I think one point that Frog, I guess, kind of touched on, but I'll just add on to is like, in terms of like equity, the really cool thing about wheelchair basketball is that, for example, like as a 4.5, in some instances, I'm almost competing against some of the low class players for playing time. So like within that 14-point lineup, that combination, like that really dictates who gets to play. And so if there's someone who has less function, but they happen to be like one of the best players in the world for that specific classification based on their function, I might not get to play because in the grand scheme of things, that might be a more valuable type of player than I am, even though I might beat them in like every objective measure. So I think that's what really one of the cool things about wheelchair basketball and equity is like, it really does take into account like your function, your disability, pretty much everything. And it lets you maximize your potential under those circumstances. And given the rules of the game, you can take those variables and also compete against people with like completely different levels of function, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think it's a really great sport and it's super cool from that aspect.
Yeah, I think that you brought up, you're one of the first that mentions the word equity here, right? Many people that know some of the work that, we're trying to do sort of not just specifically at Michigan, but across this adaptive sport landscape is truly actually just trying to provide equity, because not enough opportunities exist for individuals with disabilities to then participate in sport, period. And so one of the concerns is that we've got sport. Sport is an amazing movement that we have, but we don't have access for people with disabilities. So the goal, I would think, for most of us that are involved in this parasport and adaptive sport landscape is trying to then provide as many opportunities as we can. So it's really interesting to then hear that sometimes the things that we then are doing within our own space may feel as though they're making people compete against one another for space in the sport itself. For N of one, my opinion is that we need to do whatever we can to expand those opportunities. Now, you all have been alluding to some things, and so I'll mention that that initiated by the direction from the International Paralympic Committee, there are some pending changes to the classification system in wheelchair tennis that's governed by the International Tennis Federation, and wheelchair basketball governed by the International Wheelchair Basketball Federation. So to put significance of these changes into context, in wheelchair tennis specifically, some athletes with disabilities may no longer be classifiable in their sport as of next year. And additionally, in January of 2020, wheelchair basketball was temporarily removed as a sport from the Paris 2024 Paralympic Games due to non-compliance with the IPC standards. The changes to the classification system and standards are part of a continual process to monitor and evaluate sports to ensure competitive integrity and equity. So going back to Johan, can you please touch on why there are changes being made to wheelchair tennis classifications and what you think the expected impacts are going to be on the sport with regard to competition and equity?
Yeah, so what the big changes that they're doing now is essentially they're trying to formulate the classification to be a little bit more objective and then also trying to be more equitable. And the way they went about by trying to do that was to then exclude certain issues, diagnoses, conditions that are kind of more related to pain, for example, hypermobility. So you may not have a very obvious disability, when you're just kind of standing there or sitting there. But, in terms of them being able to play like able-bodied tennis, for example, that's going to be a lot more difficult. So for example, we can talk about two athletes in particular. So on the more famous side, you have Alfie Hewitt from the Great Britain. and he has Perthes disease. He had it when he was a young child. He kind of played through it. Loved playing soccer. Unfortunately, that really caused him a lot of pain and kind of irreversible damage to his hips. And for those who don't know, Perthes disease essentially is you're not getting enough blood flow to your head of the femur, so that part of the bone can essentially break down, and then you can also have avascular necrosis, which causes a lot of pain, and really needs a kind of a surgical treatment, especially at his point where it was very, very severe. But he kind of went through with it and now isn't able to like move very well. He's able to walk, you know, a few steps here and there, but in order to ask him to then start running and playing against, you know, other elite players such as, you know, Roger Federer, for example, that's just not going to be possible with his disability. However, he's in this new classification. He's now deemed like not disabled enough to be able to participate in wheelchair tennis. And, you know, this is someone who uses tennis as his livelihood. He is an elite player. He's young. He has his whole future career in front of him. So this is a pretty big issue for him in terms of this change in classification. And then, and just to kind of bring it back down to a little bit more of the local national level, you know, one of our players here at Michigan, Chris Kelly, he has osteogenesis imperfecta, and essentially his bones are just not very strong. So he's not able to run because he has a risk of fracturing bones. But similarly, because that's an issue where he technically does not have a limb deficiency, right? He has no amputation. There's no difference in the length of his limbs either. And he is able to walk, right? So now he's not disabled enough to be able to participate in wheelchair tennis. Even though you could even argue, what if you had an amputee with, you know, below the knee amputee who has this prosthesis, they would be able to move laterally much better than Chris could. But they, because they're trying to be more objective, they would allow the amputee to play, but not the athlete who has more of a pain issue in terms of why they're not allowed to participate in able-bodied tennis. So it definitely kind of creates, they're trying to be equal, but at the same time now they're less inclusionary. They're excluding a lot more athletes from being able to play tennis, and this prevents you from exercising. And if you're on the elite side, this prevents you from, you know, playing out the rest of your career.
Now, you know, we may have somebody in our presence who we may have to have a little conversation with about some of these changing classification systems. If you say that one of our athletes might not be classifiable, but before we get to sort of paying this young man under the table, let's get to Erica and talking about sort of how these things may be impacting wheelchair basketball space.
Yeah, I mean, just to, I guess, add on what Johan was saying, it's interesting because, I mean, I was one of the athletes, I just retired this past September, but I was one of the athletes who literally got a message one day in February 2020 saying that I might not be able to compete in the Paralympic Games 5 months from that, like almost exactly 5 months from that point, after I had just finished training for like 3.5 years. And I mean, the thing with that though is that we actually weren't supposed to find out our results until June, and this was before COVID came. So they were telling us that we needed to train for the next 4 months-ish for the Paralympics, with a very high likelihood of not actually being able to compete. And I mean, I've been through, I would say, a lot in my life, but I would say like that 5-month window might be the most stressful thing I've ever gone through. And I think, I mean, being a high performance athlete is hard. And I mean, as much as I love basketball, it wasn't always fun, Frog. But I mean, similar to tennis, though, like I think personally, and I mean, I've been involved with IWBF a lot over the last year and also IPC, and it really comes down to legality. Like IPC has to have their policy, and the teams within that Paralympic umbrella, they have to meet those policies in order to be part of the IPC. So it's really just the IPC saying that we need to cover ourselves legally so that one of the sports that we exclude from the games can't come back and sue us for not meeting the criteria. And I think with like, this is also coming from my high performance athlete mindset, that like the thing is in Paralympic sport, like the goal is to win medals, and like you win medals, you get more money from the government. Well, at least in Canada, that's how it works. So like, I don't think that while we can say like it's about increasing participation and stuff, at the end of the day, it really is about winning medals. So with these changes and money, it's just like so complex, and I don't think it's like to make things equitable. It's to prevent yourself from getting sued, essentially.
You know, that is a perspective that I'm sure people don't take into consideration all the time, right? People don't hear that aspect of these conversations around sort of the litigious nature of certain things and trying to sort of protect some of these national governing bodies and these systems from that. So I think that, thank you for bringing that one in. Now going to Jason, you know, we'll talk about sort of this bigger picture and taking into account wheelchair tennis and or wheelchair basketball. You know, when the new classification changes take place, do you think there's going to be an impact in sport for the long term? And there are multiple places we can go with this, really, from international competition, player development, domestic leagues. You know, what are some of your thoughts on what that might do?
You know, it's such a complicated, it seems like it could be simple, but it is so complicated. And having seen it from really the last 25 plus years, I mean, the ITF, our international governing body, is now, along with the IPC, has put what they call an MIC, right? A minimum impairment criteria, which every single tennis player, at least on the professional level, has had to be reclassified to be deemed, you're eligible to play. And so someone like Alfie, who has a degenerative situation, he is going to ultimately probably be back into wheelchair tennis at some point. Now, of course, at what speed does his situation degenerate to where he's back in, he gets reclassed in? We don't know. But ultimately, what does it do to the sport? And I think it's important. Recreational and pro, it's going to be different paths. I think the IPC's decision to really press for these class issues, I think is very interesting, because another component, power chairs, has been a controversial subject. And the IPC has banned power chairs from competing in a sport like tennis at the Paralympic Games starting now. And one of our great champions, Nick Taylor, is no longer playing because of that. And if you look at the charter of what the IPC believes they stand for, is creating more opportunity, creating, potentially more divisions, more classification. That's like right up their alley. And so to be heading in that direction really was a very confusing message for us. It was a confusing message for the ITF. Now, these renewed standards of classification affecting someone like Alfie. And again, what does that do from a litigious standpoint? Are they just protecting themselves? I think in this situation, they could be setting themselves up for some legal problems, to be challenged. And I think, of course, they have, every athlete that is dealing with this has that right. Alfie's not the only one, at least in tennis. And so ultimately, what does it do for participation? I'm not sure. It's some of the quad classification issues we thought over the years. It was going to be, I think if it's not enforced correctly, it's actually going to be a deterrent for some players to come and play. I've had players from other sports, other quad sports, rugby in particular, who would come out to look at tennis as maybe something they would do to cross train, which we're all big fans of as athletes. But when they saw that classification maybe wasn't as controlled or policed as well as it should have been, they decided not to play. And I think, at that time, the ITF thought by creating this system, it would bring more people in, and it actually did the opposite. So that's more professional level, but I think it affects the grassroots, because people, if they're competitive people and they want, the United States Tennis Association, we have a full grassroots system in place for tournament play, both sanctioned tournaments, unsanctioned. It's all level based now. It's not gender based. It's not men playing men, women playing women. It's just everybody plays together. It's based upon your ability, which is been very successful. But for players like Chris and Alfie, it's unfortunate because I think the minimum impairment agrees that you have a disability. But at this moment, the system believes that your impairment isn't at a level to play. Now, Alfie's an exception in that he was allotted two 1-year extensions due to COVID. And that was controversial because a lot of the players on tour, I think, who have an issue with his function level, felt like by allowing him to continue to play, he was potentially going to win more events, win more Grand Slams, win more money, increases his stock in history where he's going to end up historically. And a lot of players thought that, not a lot, but some thought that might be unfair by allowing him to continue to play, even though he had technically been disqualified 2 years ago. Right. So you can see where the controversy lies. But again, there's two sides to it. If you're Alfie, what are you saying? You're saying, this is my livelihood. This is what I enjoy. This is what makes me happy. And I am excellent at this. But if you're someone who is a high level para, you might feel as though you have no business playing Alfie, but yet the division is open. So I know the ITF and the IPC are addressing classification. It is beginning in January. There is a new system being put in place, but it's not complete yet. And we don't know. I mean, even someone like myself who's been around a long time, I do not know ultimately what it's going to end up like, but I think the drive is to increase participation. And again, I think with all classification, you're going to have to wait and see how it plays out. Do former players who left the sport because of classification issues come back? Do they come back as they now feel that the playing field is a little bit more level? That's possible. It's part of the experiment, I suppose. But I think, as Frog said earlier, it's function versus medical. That is a challenge, right? So it's controversial. It's complicated, but I think there is somewhere in the mix, somewhere in this bouillabaisse of just technical. There's a way through it, but it's not clean. It's never been clean, meaning it's never 100% perfect. And that's like life. So I think a lot of smart people are really working on it. Contributors like myself are trying to give some input. So hopefully in tennis, it works itself through soon, right? Because this is an issue that's been drawn out for quite a few years. This goes back well before London, which is 2012. And it does seem to be, we're kind of kicking the can down the road, but it is affecting, it's going to affect livelihoods of several players, especially on the professional side. So, yeah.
Thanks, Jason. So, you ended right there by talking about the professional side. And this whole time, we've kind of been focusing on this sort of elite level of sport play. And we've talked about that this is people's livelihood. We've talked about people and sort of their professional identity formation in terms of how far they can get in the sport. Now, before I give Frog the mic, people have heard me talk about the fact that I would love for people without disabilities to be able to play adaptive sport, because I see sport as just an opportunity for everyone to participate together. And so in my opinion, if we could come up with a way to allow everyone to play, but then we refine these classification systems, right? Because imagine if you have all sorts of little kids, playing in the backyard with all their friends, no matter whether they have a disability or not, and they see sport as just sport. They don't see this as a classification system. They don't see this as this kid is different than me or I'm different than them, but they want to play together. And, I'll give a little nod here, because while this individual didn't do this all on their own, our own Eric Rebesniks has been working on some ideas around the inclusion of individuals without disabilities in adaptive sport. And I know that the NWBA has been making some considerations about what that could look like, which is why I'm going to transition that to Frog, because there could be opportunities where you don't even have to have the sort of the minimum disability to participate in adaptive sports. You don't have to have any disability at all, but that just makes it such that we have to then expand what that then means in terms of the classification system. And I think we can then get to a point where we do then create very sort of clear delineation between who can compete against whom. But I think overall it increases the number of people, because you can't just go to your local gym or YMCA and find a team to play on if there aren't enough people playing the sport, right? But if everybody can play, then you can have that little kid that goes to their local Y and can have a seated volleyball team or a wheelchair rugby team or wheelchair basketball team to play on. And so at least just once again, from my standpoint, no, I've never been an elite Paralympic athlete. I don't have a desire currently to then build my professional identity around that. And I'm not making money from it, but I see kids growing up in communities that don't have an opportunity to play. And it's because there aren't enough people playing. So Frog, you don't have to touch on that part specifically, but I'm sure you've got your own perspective on these things that you can add to the mix too.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess a couple things I'd say. I think the problems in classification, and I'll use the challenges between the IPC and the IWBF. I think there was the problem is in the system needs to be refined. There needs to be education around the system, and then the system needs to be some of the problems that they talk about are problems of implementation. I think that it is never healthy when we try to solve problems by excluding individuals. I think we know that. I think we can go back in numerous examples throughout history and see how that is not good. And when and that sort of looks a little bit like how a problem's trying to be solved right now. So I don't think that this is a sustainable solution as it is. I think that it might be a solution for a period of time, or it might be a way we're going for a period of time, maybe not a solution, but eventually we're going to go back to a more inclusive model. I think that that's important. I think it's important for us to remember that sport is something that everybody has a right to have access to. And I think we need to keep some of those things in mind when they're trying to solve these problems around classification. Yeah, classification is messy. Every time we think we've got it solved, there's some new problem that arises. But that doesn't mean we should stop looking for ways to expand and include people. I think of the history of wheelchair basketball classification. Actually, it's really fascinating. The system was originally designed with spinal cord injuries in mind, because those were the individuals post World War II that were all of a sudden living beyond 2 weeks. And now we wanted to look for different things for them. And one of the things they used was wheelchair basketball. And then all of a sudden you go through the 50s and 60s, and there's a generation of individuals with polio that come in, and they're not quite as clean and neat from a spinal cord injury perspective, but they wanted to play. So how do we adapt the system to include them? And then keeping in mind, during all this time, we didn't have amps in yet. And then all of a sudden we added amputees, individuals with amputations, later on. And then how did that impact the system? And then we expanded what it meant to have a disability, and we created the category of minimum disability. And now this has been a controversial category, but when I look at a sport like wheelchair basketball, they've addressed the problems of classification. It's been bumpy along the way, but they found a way to increasingly include more and more people. And what I think is really cool when we think of how do we include people, and let's solve the problem with that in mind, I actually think of myself. So I'm doing this, a little chat right now, and in a few hours, I'm going to go to our local recreation facility. I'm going to do a junior wheelchair basketball program. I'm going to be sitting there in my wheelchair teaching people. 3 of the people that will be on the court with me will be my 3 kids. And my 3 kids don't have motor impairments. They don't have a disability like that. Why do they go? They just love it. They think it's a cool sport. A wheelchair is just a piece of sports equipment. And, they have different levels of involvement. My daughter, she likes to be active. She likes the thinking part of the game. My middle guy, Javon, he's thinking, maybe I want to do this a little bit more competitively. Maybe he wants to go, he's thinking, should I maybe train with the Ontario Canada Games team? And my youngest guy, he just loves sports, period. If it's a team sport, he does it because he just loves sports. So they have slightly different reasons for doing them. None of it has anything to do with whether they have a disability or anything like that. I happen to coach wheelchair basketball, so that's what they play. If I was a hockey coach, they'd probably be playing hockey. If I was a baseball coach, they'd play baseball. And this is a great way for me my kids to do something together. That's what sport's supposed to be about, bringing people together and not excluding them. So I guess that's where I would go with it. I think it's going to be a blip. I don't think it's going to, the way classification is going internationally is going to cause growth. I don't think it's necessarily going to help it. And I think eventually we're going to go back to a more, I'll say, inclusive model for classification that gets more people involved.
Thanks for humanizing this some as well, Frog, because I've got a 10-year-old son, and similarly, he comes with me and plays sports and loves being around the team and has got to know a lot of the student athletes here at Michigan and just loves being out there with them. And he loves sports and he loves people, and he's 10. And he's the one that when you ask him what adaptive sports are, he's like, it's sports that just allow everybody to play together. Now, of course, as he's growing up and being with his peers, there's still this stigma at times where you can tell that depending on the people he's around, sometimes he's much more comfortable being in the chair playing sports. But there are other times where he's starting to now see the fact that people see that thing as some sort of medical device. And so as he's developing his own identity, he does not have a disability either. And he now is in this middle ground where sometimes he wants to then run around and play while we're in chairs. So he will play able-bodied basketball while we're still sitting and playing wheelchair basketball. And that's trying to make sure that he sees something that most adults don't see, which is no difference in those of us that are playing in the chairs or someone that then gets up and walks out afterwards. And so the impact that sport can have is beyond just, as we said, people's salaries. It's truly an opportunity to then demonstrate equity amongst all of us. But I don't want to take too much time. I know, Erica, I'm sure that you had some things that you wanted to add to this as well, and then we'll let Dr. LaTorre answer before we go to our last question. So Erica, turn it over to you.
Yeah, I think with all this classification stuff going on between, tennis and wheelchair basketball, it's one thing that's important to understand too, is that people are trying to develop these MICs in a very short amount of time without, I would say, potentially the research needed to do so. And so I feel like some of these MICs, like while the interesting thing about Paralympic sport is that people like to throw around the word inclusive, but if you actually look at Paralympic sport, like classification is based on excluding people based on impairment. So, it's really not inclusive at all. But then I think another thing too, like with the future and the way things are right now, like it's easy for international federations to say, well, IPC changed the classification code, we're excluding all these athletes, etc. But the thing is that the only impact IPC has on these international federations is at the Paralympic Games. So technically speaking, all these federations could actually have an able-bodied category or any category that they possibly want, but they just have to be the ones exactly. And for the most part, the federations are based off of like quadrennials. So I don't think like that's really been explored too much, just based on like how funding works and whatnot. But I think like moving forward, and as people see it as like not only an opportunity to get more people involved, but then also to like improve the quality of the sport in general, I think it could come back to being more inclusive long term, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and as I said last, Dr. LaTorre, on this one, I know that as a resident, as a fellow, as participating in a program, you've sort of brought a lot of these conversations to bear as well. You've done some grand rounds presentations on this. So, what from your seat, what do you think about some of the things that have been shared with respect to this most recent question?
Yeah, so I feel as a doctor who's we're trying to promote more exercise in individuals. Doesn't matter if you have a disability or not, everyone should be exercising and being healthy in general. I think this new classification could make things even more difficult for just for the little kids who are just starting or someone who just was injured to get involved in sport, because if I personally, so the way I got into adaptive sports was as a medical student. I just saw wheelchair rugby, and I thought it was just an amazing thing. It was a lot of fun. They let me play with them, and the biggest thing was that there was brand new spinal cord injuries who were young 20s, pretty devastated about what having a life-changing event just occur. But they saw some individuals who were just playing sports and having fun, and they were like, that could be me. And they tried much harder in rehab the following days right after that, simply because they just saw what could be their future. And so I think sport is like super, super important in that aspect. And if you're then going to tell someone, hey, you're not disabled enough anymore to like really compete anymore, but you're someone who's very competitive, then you're kind of taking away a little bit of their purpose and what they want to do for enjoyment. And what are they going to do for exercise? So they're like, well, why am I going to bother trying if I can't even play in a competition or a tournament at my local, tennis court or basketball court or wherever it may be? So it has like huge implications from the elite to the grassroots levels. And if you're affecting the grassroots, then you're not going to have elite players in the future, or it's going to be a much smaller event. So think about it, even in like the big picture of like Paralympics, the epitome of like competition. If you're now having a much smaller event simply because there just aren't enough people participating anymore, and the levels aren't as high because no one's pushing each other anymore, then it kind of everything's affected just by these simple little changes. So I think these classifications are difficult, and it's it's not a simple thing, as Jason mentioned. It's been talked since London. It's not as if they just came up with it over a month or so. So it's really difficult. Conversations need to be had about what is the goal of all this. What are we trying to really do? Are we trying to include more? Are we trying to have more levels of classification? Like, what is the purpose? Because if you don't know what the purpose is, then we don't really know what we're really doing with these classification systems by breaking them up or making them more broad. So I think this simple thing is really going to be a big issue for not just our sports here that are being displayed today, but for all the others. And the last thing I want to add is that I'm able-bodied, and like when I play with the guys and practice and stuff, I usually play standing. Main reason is because they're way better than me in the chair. Like yesterday, we played in the chair, and everyone beat me. So like I just can't participate like well enough to like compete against them. So I have to stand up to at least be able to like hit the ball back, or else I'm just the one struggling essentially. And I don't have the time to like put the hours in to like get better. So it's a lot of people think just because it's in a chair is somehow easier, but it's just a different sport. Basketball and wheelchair basketball are not the same exact sport. Yes, you're playing on the same place, but the technique, the strategies, they're all different. It's a different sport. You may be great, you may be LeBron James and dunking a ball, but you're not going to be doing that on wheelchair basketball, right? So I think that's another way to kind of push inclusivity, is that this is, like everyone's mentioned, it's a sport. Everyone needs to put in the time if you want to get better at it. You can't just because you have core or your legs simply just be great at it just because.
And this is, I think, a good transition into this last question, because the classification system in parasport is an iterative process. And as we've discussed today, that there are many variables to take into consideration when determining a classification system that creates equitable opportunity for competition. Now, we're honored to have the opportunity to partner with the Exercise and Sports Science Initiative here at Michigan. And I think it's important to then say that research could also play a role in some of this. And so, Eric, I know that you are making your scholarly work around some of this. So what do you think that research can do to then play a role in driving changes and supporting this iterative process of classification? And are there any research opportunities that you think currently exist in wheelchair basketball that then you'd like to share as we're wrapping up?
I mean, like, I'll be honest, from my perspective, as someone like a PhD student in parasport, the exciting thing for me is that there's really nothing out there. And I think I would say over the last few years, like while I'm like working to finish my PhD and whatnot, like for me, I would say it's more about just like trying to improve the quality of sport, because I think a lot of my struggles in parasport were because I came from an able-bodied system sometimes, where like there has been a lot of research around, well, pretty much everything, and then transitioning to para and like trying to figure out ways to improve performance and everything else, but the research not necessarily being there. And I think playing well under Frog, like he would never say this, but like out of any coach I've ever played for, he like really understands the impact that research can have in sport, and like in terms of like pushing the edge and like classification, kind of what I said, like I feel like these MICs, they are the way they are right now because there's no research and they needed a quick solution to a problem. And if they didn't come up with like an entire criteria in a couple of months, wheelchair basketball was being excluded from the games. And like I was a part of that entire process, and like a lot of the questions that were in there and like a part of like establishing the criteria, like it was very much like medical and like a quick fix to a really big problem that probably created more problems. So I would say from like an opportunity standpoint, like even chatting with my sports psychologist, like even there needs to be research around the impact that classification has on athletes. And then also too, like I don't know about other sports, but it makes no sense to me why when you get classed, if you're set up in your chair a certain way, you're like, it can change your classification, although it's a mobility, like it's a change that everyone can possibly do. So I mean, like if anyone wants to do any classification research, it's completely open. You'll do really well because there's not much there. Like I can't play wheelchair basketball anymore because there's no research. Like that's the impact it's had on my career. Like thank goodness I'm in school. I don't know what I would be doing. So yeah, anyway.
Yeah, so I know, Johan, I know that you have been doing some research in this space as well, and has been making this part of your own scholarly work and the trajectory you want to take your life. So what kind of closing thoughts will you have before we pass it over to Mr. Hartnett to close us out?
Yeah, so I want to echo with Erica in terms about research in general, right? There is no research. There's very, very few articles. So like part of my grand rounds was just looking for articles to talk about. And if you put tennis in like PubMed, which is a huge database for articles, you get like over 8,000 hits for like able-bodied tennis. If you put wheelchair tennis, you only get 57. And of those 57, practically almost like 5 of them are like only wheelchair tennis, while the others are like a combination of multiple different sports put together to talk about like mobility or something like that. So you're not, and then the sample sizes are like 3. And then you're just like, what are we really getting out of it? You know, from just such a small sample size of each sport. You get a rough understanding of like, yeah, different sports move differently. Yes, that's true. But then it's really difficult to extrapolate that into like a bigger picture. And besides just in terms of like performance, you know, there's injury prevention. What do we do to make sure that our athletes are not hurting their shoulders as they get older? You know, and on top of that, what about coaching, right? If we want more people to play, we got to be able to coach them efficiently so that they're able to participate better. You know, tennis is not something you can just pick up a racket and you're like good at it. You know, it takes like, you know, technique to just even get the ball over. And if you're getting frustrated because you don't understand like the right way to do that, or using the type of ball you're using, then, you know, it can make things just harder. So like, for example, there's actually an article, a research paper that someone did. It used low compression balls on a wheelchair basketball team. And it said, hey, we're going to learn how to play tennis. And people who play with the low compression balls had much more fun because the ball was going over more and they were able to participate more, and they wanted to continue playing. So that's a great way of just kind of getting them learning how to, like, you know, have the right stroke to play and whatnot, so that they don't get frustrated and go, I'm just not going to do this sport, I'll pick something else instead. So it has like, research really has a way to impact coaching, classification, performance, injury prevention, but we have none. So like even the rules for ITF with all the changes, they actually cite a lot of able-bodied tennis research in terms of like lateral movement and things. And you're just like, why does that matter? You know, like, are you just like, yeah, I get it's tennis and there's similarities, but at the end of the day, if you're using this to classify individuals, it doesn't make the best sense. It's just opinion now. There's nothing to back it up.
I'll tell you what, interesting to hear, Dr. Johan, you pretty much said almost everything I would say. Is there's so much opportunity for research in parasport in general. There's such little, so few publications from any credible sources that are being put out there, so much informal. A lot of our coaching has been informal. And so I know that's something here at the USTA, we're really focusing on research opportunities. Jason Allen, one of our managers here at the USTA, is focusing on coaching education as something that has needed to be done for a long time, a formalization, using more of a formalized educational structure as opposed to anecdotal and informal coaching, which is content driven. It's great content, but is the coaching aspect being done correctly? So that's something he's focused on, which is great. But when you talk about research and classification, injury prevention, all those things, there's so much opportunity for universities to get engaged. Loughborough University in England is the one leading the charge in classification. That was a decision by the ITF to go third party, which is smart, to make it as objective as possible. But back to Erica's point about trying to squeeze this in quick, there's been arguments that on the tennis side, they wanted to see action in classification because it felt like nothing was happening. So all of a sudden you're kind of forced to make a decision that you might have to unwind within a couple of years, that you realize you weren't thorough enough, or it doesn't cover what you needed to cover. So you're gonna have to revisit it. And of course, that's an irritant to players because we're revisiting classification again, and we keep having to come back to it. So plenty of opportunities. I'm very optimistic and hopeful that we're gonna get as close as we can get. There are challenges on the professional tennis side with professional events, adding divisions. Are they able to do that logistically, financially? There's great challenges there. But I think grassroots wise, there's plenty of room for growth, and classification drives all of it. So, but from a research standpoint, it's almost boundless. In any direction you choose, there's plenty of opportunity. So, Dr. Johan, spot on.
Now, I wish we had more time to allow more people to then get into this conversation. We had a couple questions come through the Q&A, but hopefully this is really just starting this conversation, and we can continue to then have this offline here. I really want to thank, ESSI, our Exercise and Sports Science Initiative at the University of Michigan. I want to give thanks to each and every one of our panelists who gave their time to be here. Thanks to our ASL interpreter, Sam, and Anne, who's been helping us with CART services, and the University of Michigan for hosting this. I think people can see that from grassroots to professional, from research to recreation, adaptive sports is just another opportunity for us to then demonstrate diversity, equity, inclusion, and that at all sort of aspects of lived experience of the world, for children in elementary school, for people in their professional lives, for individuals who just want to get access to sport and wellness. Adaptive sports is a robust field that has just as many opportunities for scholarly work and for recreational involvement. And so hopefully this will then encourage other people to continue to sort of then carry this torch and then find ways that they can, in their communities, expand equitable opportunities in sport. So with that, thank you so much to everyone that participated. As we said, this recording will be available hopefully in about a week online, and we look forward to engaging all of you out there in the adaptive sports world. Thank you so much. And to the Canadians out there and everybody else, I gotta say, go blue.